at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I want to welcome our witnesses here with us today. This morning, we will be hearing from Dr. Heather Boucher, President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, the Honorable William Spriggs, Chief Economist at the AFL-CIO and Professor of Economics at Howard University, Ms. Kismet Evans, one of Mr. Horsford's constituents and a home health care worker from Las Vegas, Nevada, and Mr. Ramesh Ponnuru, visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a frequent television commentator. Nice to have you all with us today. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for my opening statement. As a Congress, we have a responsibility to support policies that give all hardworking Americans the opportunity to succeed, no matter where they started out. Unfortunately, policies implemented over the past few decades have helped usher in an era of economic inequality that remains one of our most pressing economic and fiscal challenges. During today's hearing, we will examine the causes and consequences of inequality and discuss possible solutions to strengthen our families and our federal budget. Over the past 30 years, the richest 1% of Americans have seen their wealth grow by nearly 300%. At the same time, the poorest 50% saw no growth, even as the cost of housing, health care, food, child care, and other basic necessities have gone up and up and up, making it nearly impossible for millions of American families to make ends meet. The share of national income held by the wealthiest Americans has also increased to levels not seen since the 1920s, right before the Great Depression. In short, our economy has left working families behind. The inequality it has created has impacted every generation. Our nation's seniors are struggling to retire. Recent college graduates and young people are putting off buying their first homes or investing in assets that could increase their wealth. Parents are finding it harder and harder to afford college, job training, and child care, all of which are key to finding success in a changing world. Our nation's economic future depends on the success of working Americans. Plain and simple, if they don't succeed, our country doesn't succeed. Economic inequality is suppressing economic growth and eroding our tax base. It's putting pressure on federal, state, and local budgets, and it is increasing the likelihood of a financial downturn. In fact, income inequality has cost the United States up to 9 percentage points in cumulative economic growth over the past 2 decades. But it's important to understand that the rise in inequality is not just rooted in structural changes, globalization, or other forces beyond our control. It is also a result of decades of policy geared to help the very rich at the expense of everyone else. Beginning in the 1970s, as the United States experienced major technological advancements, our country failed to take the steps needed to ensure shared prosperity. Instead, workers suffered from trickle-down economic policies, financial industry deregulation, and attacks on organized labor. As a result, wage growth slowed and income and wealth consolidated with the top 1%. Unfortunately, here we are again. Rapid advancements in automation and artificial intelligence are set to reshape a broad swath of industries. In fact, a top official at IBM told me earlier this year that in the next 3 years alone, artificial intelligence will eliminate or significantly change 120 million jobs around the world. 120 million jobs in just 3 years. We need to make sure that the new industries of the future and the skilled workers they demand will call the United States home, not China or any other country. Instead, we just blew $1.9 trillion on the Republican tax law that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and did little to improve our nation's economy or prepare us for the future. Continued efforts to deregulate the financial industry and roll back consumer protections are endangering working Americans. Legislation aimed at weakening unions is spreading in state houses across the country, and we are setting a record for the longest period in U.S. history without an increase in the federal minimum wage. What's worse, the current administration is advancing policies that would expand work requirements and redefine poverty to make fewer people eligible for assistance, which in turn makes it even harder for them to succeed. America's greatest asset has always been our people, more specifically our workforce. And in this rapidly changing world, it is also our greatest opportunity. But the federal government must step up. We must make a national commitment to early childhood education and work to make college more affordable, raise the minimum wage, expand job training opportunities, and invest in the programs that help struggling families get ahead. We need to address our aging infrastructure by overhauling our crumbling roads and bridges, updating communication systems, expanding broadband services to rural areas, all while creating the new jobs of the future. And we need responsible tax policies that will ensure companies invest here in U.S. workers and in the new industries that will drive innovation for generations. We must do all of this and more, not only because economic inequality hurts American families and hinders their success, which should be enough, but because it also threatens our ability to compete in a rapidly changing global economy. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on the importance of creating an economy that works for all Americans and strengthens our fiscal future. And now, just one UC request. I ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from First Focus on Children, along with 3 of their reports entitled Children's Budget 2019, Shortchanging Our Children Harms the Nation, and Implementing a Roadmap to Reducing Child Poverty. I ask unanimous consent to insert those all in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I now yield to the ranking Vice Chair, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership here on the Budget Committee. And you know, there are many things in your opening statement that you and I actually agree on. I wish we could find on this committee more common ground as it relates to our core task, because it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, once again, our committee has convened a hearing that does not focus on what we are here to do, and that is to advance a budget and manage our ballooning national debt. The title of today's hearing is Solutions to Rising Economic Inequality, but I'm concerned this hearing is focused on the wrong premise, that income inequality can only be solved by redistributing wealth, increasing the minimum wage, and eliminating pro-growth, pro-family policies like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Instead, we should be focusing this committee's time on policies that create jobs, increase wages, and expand opportunities for all Americans. Having lived in extreme poverty as a child myself, I am so grateful that we live in a country where Americans from all walks of life have the opportunity to improve their economic situation. And we must continue to build upon pro-growth successes, such as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, to ensure upward economic mobility is within reach for all hardworking American families. Today, I look forward to hearing more about the leading proposal for wealth redistribution, the universal basic income. We have heard a lot about universal basic income over the last few months as presidential hopefuls discuss ways to address what they call the income inequality crisis in our country. Just last week, we heard one presidential candidate reiterate his support for a program that would give $12,000 a year to each and every American adult. With a $28 trillion price tag, this type of proposal would not just bust the budget and compound our existing mandatory spending crisis, but it would also diminish the dignity of work. The Budget Committee is supposed to be the committee of fiscal discipline, and we have a responsibility to ensure that our government's finite resources are helping to grow the economy, create jobs, and raise wages for all. That's why my Republican colleagues and I will continue to support pro-growth policies that expand opportunities, create jobs, and ensure that wages continue to rise. This past year was the first tax year under the new Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and American families kept more of their hard-earned money. As a result of the law, a family of 4 with $73,000 of income received a $2,000 tax cut, a 58% reduction in federal taxes. And by nearly doubling the standard deduction and preserving and strengthening provisions that support families, such as doubling the child tax credit, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act ensures that Americans can keep more of their hard-earned money to spend, save, and invest as they see fit. Families are seeing bigger paychecks, with the median income rising by 3.4% in 2018, and fewer Americans are living in poverty, with the poverty rate dropping from 12.3% to 11.8%, according to the latest Census Bureau data. Mainstream economists agree that strong economic growth is the key to increasing wages and living standards, so we should be doing all we can to ensure our current economic growth continues and expands. Once again, I return to this idea that we are here asking the wrong question. This hearing should not be about income inequality. Instead, it should be about policies that encourage economic growth to provide all Americans with more opportunities for upward mobility. And while we have made important strides over the past few years, the cost of living for middle-class families continues to rise, predominantly in heavily regulated and subsidized sectors of the economy, including healthcare, higher education, and housing. Republicans stand ready to tackle the root causes of these cost increases so we can put the American dream within reach for more families across our great nation. Implementing free market policies to increase competition and drive down prices in these important sectors can build upon our current progress rather than exacerbating our problems by raising taxes and slowing economic growth. It is my hope that in today's hearing, we will discuss how we can help people succeed in our economy by enacting policies that grow the economy, create jobs, and boost paychecks for Americans from all walks of life. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio for his opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Once again, I would like to thank all of our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Dr. Boucher, you may start when you are ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack, for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Heather Boucher, and I'm President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We seek to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broadly shared economic growth. I'm an economist by training, and I'd like to summarize for you what the economics field has discovered about economic inequality in all its forms, income, wealth, and across firms, to name a few, and their effects on productivity and growth. To get to the punchline, what we found is that inequality constricts growth by obstructing, subverting, and distorting the processes that lead to higher productivity, greater output, and overall well-being. Let me start with the current economic situation. We are in the longest expansion in recorded U.S. history. The economy continues to add jobs month after month, and the unemployment rate remains historically low. But the strong headline numbers have not translated into the kinds of wage gains we'd expect to see for workers up and down the income ladder. As has been increasingly become the case over the past 4 decades, earnings for low and middle-income Americans have grown slowly or not at all, while incomes for those at the top, both in terms of income and wealth, have surged. From 1980 to 2016, those in the top 1% saw their incomes after taxes and transfers rise by more than 180%, and those in the top 0.001% saw their incomes grow by more than 600%. At the same time, those in the bottom half of the income spectrum saw only a 25% increase, according to research by economists Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman. They further find that the richest 160,000 American families own a collective $11 trillion in wealth, or as much as the entire bottom 90% of the U.S. population. The U.S. Census Bureau and Federal Reserve likewise confirm that inequality by wealth and income are reaching record levels and continue to grow. Now, some argue that focusing on inequality is misplaced and that the most important goal is to grow the pie, just to focus on growth. To be very clear, the empirical evidence from the economics profession shows that this is wrong. There's a large and growing body of research that shows that we cannot create strong or broadly shared economic gains through a policy agenda that presumes that growth follows from allowing those at the top to reap the bulk of the gains. Our inequality-filled economy now grows slower than it did when we were less unequal. Today, we grow, over the past few decades, we've grown at an annual pace of about 1.3% compared to a larger 1.7% in the 1960s and 70s. So how do we get back to growth that is strong, stable, and broadly shared? Well, we need to confront the fact that we've spent decades systemically undermining the capacity of institutions that were set up to constrain and constrict inequality. We must reverse this. I encourage you to think about the structural effects of concentrated economic wealth and power by focusing on the following solutions. First, I encourage you to measure what matters, to focus not just on that aggregate growth number, but to look at what that means in terms of income gains across the income spectrum. The Measuring Real Income Growth Act, introduced by Representative Carolyn Maloney, would tell us what growth looks like for low, middle, and high-income Americans and allow us to design policies accordingly. Second, we need to rebuild institutions, such as unions, that are inclusive, broad-based, and diverse, and represent the voices of working and middle-class families. I'm sure Dr. Spriggs will discuss this in more detail. Third, we must address concentrations of wealth and power and the inherently subversive effects they have on our markets and economy through stronger antitrust, enforcement, and funding. Industries from healthcare to telecommunications to airline transportation are far more concentrated than ever, leading to growing monopoly power for the few firms left standing. This leads to lower wages for workers, higher prices for consumers, and less innovation. All of that is underscored by recent empirical evidence. Fourth, as my other fellow witness will undoubtedly testify, working people need support and laws that protect their opportunity to move ahead in life and to care for their families and their personal needs. They need a higher minimum wage. We also need to protect a worker's right to know their work schedule and other policies that allow them to address conflicts between work and family. Finally, the United States should join its international peers in offering a national paid family medical leave program. Core to this agenda is the need to rebalance the power between those that have access to resources and those who do not. The current situation cannot and has not provided a path forward for strong, stable, and broadly shared income gains across the income distribution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your testimony, and now recognize Dr. William Spriggs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Yarmouth, for this invitation to speak, and to Vice Ranking Chair Johnson and members of the committee, good morning. I'm happy to offer this testimony on behalf of the AFL-CIO, America's House of Labor, representing the working people of the United States, and based on my expertise as a professor at Howard University in the Department of Economics. Income inequality is a challenge for the Committee on Budget. It's already well established that the biggest challenge to Social Security's funding is the unprecedented rise in income inequality that started in the 1980s. Addressing the cap on Social Security taxes to correct for that is well known and a simple fix to address that problem. But inequality also is a challenge because of the revenue stream. We have the lowest taxes on the portions of national income that are rising the most. So we have lower capital gains tax, we have lower corporate taxes, and those are the things that are growing. We are raising taxes on working people because that's the part that's diminishing, but that's where the tax base is and the way we've written the budget. That's a challenge going forward. If you're gonna get lower taxes for the rising part, that's a problem. But there's another problem, and that is inequality hurts growth. It slows the growth of the United States. There is a global consensus now. The International Monetary Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Bank have all deeply studied the issue of inequality and growth, and have concluded that rising inequality hurts growth, and in the specific case of the United States, our rise in inequality between 1985 and 2005 slowed our growth during the expansion we had at the beginning of this century. A fifth lower. Our growth rate was 1/5 lower. That translates to around $12 billion a quarter lower than it would have been had we maintained a lower level of, a higher level of equality, rather. For this committee, that means about $2 billion less in tax revenue. So inequality hurts growth. This is not a trade-off. This is how you get growth. And the challenge is, how do we address that? This income inequality comes from an inordinate growth of income at the top. In 1968, the middle three quintiles of the United States controlled 53% of the household income. That made this a middle-income nation. The market responded to where the money was, which was the middle. But in 1988, the share of income for the middle dipped to 50%. By 2004, half the income was with the top 20%. The problem with that is that's where the market is, that dictates the market, and specifically it dictates the market for housing and for college, because that's where the market is. Over 45% of the market in housing is in just those 1 in 5 American families, not the rest of us. That's where the dollars are. That's why the price of housing is responding to their rise in income and not to median households. How do we fix that? Studies have become clear. Union density matters. Both the IMF and independent academic researchers here in the US have found, looking at the problem from a different set of perspectives, about 40% of the rise in this inequality, the money going to the top 10% rather than to the middle, comes from the decline in union density. Removing from American workers the ability to collectively bargain over the productivity gains that American workers have been producing means whoever is at the table first gets the money, not American workers. We can also address this by raising the income from the bottom. We have to protect the bottom, and raising the minimum wage is crucial to that effort. When America had those policies of stronger collective bargaining and protecting the minimum wage, wages and productivity grew together. Labor share, therefore, stayed stable, and that meant we had a middle-income country. The problem for the Budget Committee is imagining what will the budget need to be in order for America to have private residential investment and higher education investment to be competitive in the 21st century. At this level of inequality, it is not affordable. The market cannot solve it because the bulk of Americans cannot afford those essential investments for our growth. We have gone from first in college-educated workforces in the 1990s to 19th among the advanced economies. That's not a formula for sustainable economic growth in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Ms. Evans for 5 minutes. Welcome, Ms. Evans.
Today to talk about the budget and inequality that's going on. And a special thank you to Congressman Horsford, who represents my district in Nevada. As he said, my name is Kismet Evans, and I am currently a home health provider in Las Vegas, Nevada, who serves the community. With that, hearing the previous testimony, and to make it real clear, because there's a lot of statistics and information, but let me just be clear and get to the real part of what inequality does. I am a product of inequality. 24 years ago, I was on drugs and alcohol and homeless, and through a program that gave me the resources, the information, the education, and the training necessary, I moved from that to become a business owner, receiving the California Peace Prize Award as a result of my work in the community with homeless people, with the underserved, and with the disenfranchised individuals who do not get the opportunity to become positive wage earners or receive a wage that allows them to care for their families properly, which results in them having to put themselves in compromising positions to do things that no one wants to do, but to make ends meet. These are some of the things that they end up putting themselves in. Without raising the minimum wage for individuals who work in the home health means we're taking food out of their pockets, because in the home health care industry, Every one of our compliances, we pay for DOJ, CPR, first aid, our in-service trainings, and that is taken from our minimum wage income to pay out to this company who is making billions of dollars, millions of dollars a year. How is that not inequality to the family that's trying to provide a nutritional meal to their child, or who wants to be able to send their kid down the street to the camp so that they're not sitting home going stir crazy or having to be in a community which is unsafe for them, when they can be doing something that they enjoy doing, building them up, allowing them to live and become what they desire to be. We are smashing, we are stomping on, and we are killing people's who work in the low-wage industries' dreams of having something more, doing something more. Every American deserves to be able to have security, safety, pay their bills on time, know what life is going to bring to them instead of seeing nothing but darkness, no hope or anything. I know that with the increase, we're not going to get it today because it's an incremental process, but it's a start. And those people that become wage increase earners put back into the community, become, they're able to contribute to the revenue. They're better trained, they're better educated, which means that they're gonna take and they're gonna help somebody else and pull them along. We deserve an increase, not because we need more money, but because we wanna be a better citizen, a better mother, a better father. We wanna provide for our children and give them a future, because if we don't, we are only going to continue to see more mayhem, more crime, more prostitution. And it's not the elderly or the baby boomers or the seniors. It's our kids that are being subjected to these things because parents aren't able to make ends meet. We're leaving them out of this equation. And I'm just imploring on you guys today to, make this something that's a priority, that wage increase, and for all home health workers, anybody in the service industry has a better income to become a better person in society. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Ponnuru, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Vice Chairman Johnson, and distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to be testifying before you. There is little dispute that inequality has risen since 1979, although some evidence suggests that it peaked in 2007 and has been falling since then. There is considerably more disagreement about how inequality should factor in our thinking about public policy. The view that prosperity should be broadly shared is widespread. Few of us would be satisfied with an economy in which average incomes are rising only because those at the very top were moving further up. At the same time, most of us think that rising living standards for most people are more important than the relative speeds at which different groups' living standards are rising. Many analysts have argued that economic inequality has negative effects that offer reasons to worry about it beyond its importance in itself. Some believe that greater inequality reduces economic growth. But these analyses are seriously disputed. My written testimony cites summaries of studies that suggest that inequality has only modest effects, no effects, or even positive effects on these variables. It is easy to reach erroneous conclusions about the link between inequality and wage growth because of a widespread misunderstanding of wage trends over the last several decades. Misleading claims that the average wage has been stagnant since the late 1970s, coupled with the accurate observation that inequality has risen, has heightened the impression of a causal link between these trends. But as I discuss in that testimony, using the correct adjustment for inflation reveals that wages have grown significantly, if unsteadily, over this period. None of this is to deny that there are policies worth pursuing that hold some promise of reducing inequality. But these policies are worth pursuing primarily because they would raise economic growth, boost living standards, and expand opportunity. Several provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 are examples of such policies. The bill's provisions expanding the child tax credit and the standard deduction disproportionately aided low-income and middle-income taxpayers, and the law scaled back deductions for mortgage interest and state and local tax payments that disproportionately aided high earners. A further expansion of the child credit, increasing its maximum value and making it fully refundable against payroll taxes, would recognize and foster investment in the next generation while also reducing poverty and inequality. Many other such policies would have multiple advantages in this way, loosening restrictions on the construction of housing, especially in areas of the country with high economic growth, and severe restrictions would expand opportunity. Loosening occupational licensure laws would also increase upward economic mobility, in part by increasing geographic mobility. Rethinking education policies so that they better serve the large majority of young people who do not receive college degrees could also expand opportunities. And finally, better countercyclical policy from the Federal Reserve might be able to reduce the risk and severity of recessions, limiting the damage of business cycles, which can be especially severe for those with low or no incomes. But policymakers should refrain from enacting policies that, in the name of reducing inequality, inflict major harms. The Congressional Budget Office's median estimate is that raising the minimum wage to $15 would cost 1.3 million fewer people to have jobs in the first year it took effect. A tax on wealth would reduce national saving and therefore either reduce investment in the United States or increase capital inflows, or both. To the extent that it increased capital inflows, it would raise the trade deficit. It would also be extraordinarily difficult to administer. A universal basic income would very likely reduce the labor force participation rate, which has already been in secular decline, because people would be able to have a higher income without paid work than they currently can. It would also reduce hours worked because it would require a major increase in taxation. In short, public policies that could affect inequality vary widely in their effects and thus their desirability. Policymakers should focus on ways to reduce poverty, increase mobility, and improve living standards, keeping in mind the possible drawbacks of those policies and considering their effects on inequality as a second-order consideration. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and once again, I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. And now we will begin the question period. And as a matter of courtesy, well, first of all, as our habit, the ranking member and I are going to defer our questions until the end. So I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy and also for holding this very important hearing to discuss something that impacts so many of my constituents and low-income communities across this country, which is economic inequality. I'm so excited with the panel that we have here today, particularly Ms. Kismet Evans, who is one of our constituents from our district. She is a leading voice and advocate for economic equality and fairness, and I am so delighted that you flew all the way across the country to bring your important voice to this perspective. I want to start off by highlighting the recent U.S. Census Bureau's annual report on income and poverty, which showed the importance of federal safety net programs in helping to keep millions of people from falling into poverty. Social Security benefits kept more than 27 million people out of poverty last year. SNAP benefits kept an estimated 3 million people from becoming poor. And yet the Trump administration recently announced a proposed rule related to SNAP eligibility that would negatively impact about 46,000 SNAP recipients in my state. When it comes to available affordable housing, which the panelists just spoke about, Nevada ranks as the worst in the country, according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. That's especially true for those considered extremely low income, a group that often includes those living off of Social Security or those with disabilities. In Clark County, 250,000 people, or roughly a quarter of the workforce in Southern Nevada, fall into the, quote, missing middle. Those are people earning between 60 and 120% of the median income in the area, a large chunk of whom are teachers and others in the service industry. These are individuals who we are fighting for to make sure that the programs that we support, including the home program, are preserved. And yet the Trump administration and Republicans, after doing all of this, gave a gift of $1.9 trillion in tax cuts to benefit the top 1%. Want to talk about wealth redistribution? That is the issue at hand. So, Ms. Evans, again, thank you for being here and sharing your story. You perform some of the most difficult, intensive, and important work in our society as a home health care worker and caregiver. What will the increase in the minimum wage in Nevada mean for your household and for others like you?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. First of all, the increase is something that we won't see for a while because it's an incremental process. But knowing that we are looking forward and toward an increase from what we get already, because we pay out so much of our income for compliances just to be able to have a job. So if you don't pay those compliances, you don't have a job. So one, it would mean that we wouldn't have to take so much money out of our pocket to pay for those compliances in addition to everything else that we have to pay for. We're looking for an increase so that we can become better, more attentive parents, provide better nutritional meals for our families instead of coming home after being out all night with someone else's loved ones, it's an arduous yet blessed task to care for someone. However, when we get home, I know there's people that are like, the only thing that they have enough energy to do is pop a top ramen in the oven and give it to them. I mean, the microwave.
So how does that, the pressures of being a
A
low-wage
sigh of relief. We'll be able to breathe knowing that we'll be able to do more things with the income that we'll be receiving, because we won't feel so trapped. We won't feel like we have to compromise, minimize, or condone, or put ourselves in a compromising position to make ends meet. So those are some of the real issues, having to make ends meet in other kinds of manners is what I'm sure some of the people that I work with would love to not have to contemplate.
Thank you. Well, this is a very important hearing. I also want to commend Congresswoman Lee, who has been a champion on addressing these issues of income inequality and poverty, and I know she has a number of blueprint policies that would help people like you and others that we're fighting for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the vice ranking member, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank our panel for being here. I know you've taken time out of your busy schedules to come, and I appreciate that. Several things have already been said that I think I have to clarify, because the facts and the statistics just don't match up with what's been said. Mr. Spriggs, you talked about rising taxes on middle and lower income Americans, when in fact the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did exactly the reverse. It lowered taxes on middle and lower income families. It lowered taxes for virtually all Americans. So I don't know what references you're using to get your statistics from, but the real facts don't match that. And when we talk about income and rising wages, There's always that claim that incomes are going up disproportionately for upper income wage earners than lower income wage earners. And I've been at both ends of that spectrum in my life. So I understand that dynamic. But here's what is never mentioned. It's never mentioned that the top 1% of Americans pay 37% of the taxes in this country. And it's also never mentioned that the top 50% of wage earners pay 97% of the taxes in this country, because taxes are proportional. They're percentage-based. The more you earn, the more you pay. That's the way the system works, and that's the way it should work. But let's get to some questions. Mr. Ponnuru, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act increased the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000 and increased the standard deduction from $13,000 to $24,000 for joint returns. This provides a substantial tax cut for the middle class and helps reduce the cost of raising a family. So what do you think the impact of repealing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would have on American families?
Repealing the Tax Cut and Jobs Act would be a substantial tax increase for many middle-class families. The act, as the Joint Tax Committee concluded, cut taxes for each income quintile roughly in proportion to the amount of taxes that each quintile paid. It was carefully designed to have this effect. The Joint Tax Committee has also estimated that if you look at the provisions that you mentioned, the child tax credit, the standard deduction, and also some of the deduction changes and the changes to the exemption, all told, those provisions tended to increase taxes on people making more, households making more than $100,000 a year, and decrease taxes on households making less than $100,000 a year. So those provisions in particular, I would think, need to be guarded.
Yeah, you know, we talk a lot about workforce development. In the aggregate, America doesn't have a birth rate that is replacing the aging, retiring workforce, the 10,000 baby boomers per day that are retiring. One of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that encourages families to have children and to grow their families if they want to is the child tax credit. So what are your thoughts on what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did to the child tax credit?
I think that was an extraordinarily positive development in the tax code. And I think that the crucial thing in what you said was if they want, because we do have evidence spanning decades now that Americans would like to have more kids than they end up having, to the extent that some of this is economically based and some of it is based on being overtaxed. That's something that public policy can and should address, and in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act did address.
Okay, I've got 20 seconds. I want to ask our other witnesses just real quick. It's a very quick yes or no answer. Do you think it was beneficial for American families that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the child tax credit and dramatically increased the standard deduction? Dr. Boucher, yes or no?
That's an important policy, but it's an incredibly high price to
No,
pay
I need a yes
for
or no,
the
'cause I
increase
got
in
15
deficit that we're
seconds.
going to see
Yes or
in the
no?
way that taxes are going to go up for those people
Yes or
in
no?
the future.
Dr. Spriggs, do you have an answer to that?
Because you didn't make it refundable, no.
Okay, how about you, Ms. Evans?
No.
And would you all support repealing those provisions? Ms. Evans?
Yes.
Yeah?
It has to be fixed.
No,
The
yes
child
or no?
tax-
Yes or no? Would you support
I would
repealing those?
repeal it because you have to make it refundable.
Okay, Dr. Boucher?
You need to fix the tax code, and I agree with Dr. Spriggs that making it refundable is absolutely paramount.
Okay, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the chairman of the committee, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America is founded upon the idea of equal opportunity. It's our nation's guiding principle. It's the manifestation of freedom. The single guiding phrase of the American Revolution, it has often been said, is that great Jeffersonian line from the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, which we, of course, know now includes not just men. Now, America is not a country of equal results. We thrive on free competition, and we know that some will have greater success than others. But if we don't start with equal opportunity, we cannot live up to our fundamental values and principles as a nation. Therefore, I believe the most important question before the committee today is whether rising economic inequality is due to a lack of opportunity, whether we are a country of equal opportunity or not. My colleagues across the aisle seem to think that opportunity in America is just as equal as it needs to be. They like to say two things about the problem of rising economic inequality, and we heard both from the vice-ranking member in his opening statement. The first is all we need to do is grow the economy, simply grow the economy we already have. Now, this would make sense if the current economy lived up to our ideals, that principle of equal opportunity. So we should investigate this. The second thing Republicans like to say is that this entire conversation about economic inequality is about redistributing wealth. And since they believe we shouldn't do this, we should not even have this conversation, or as the vice-ranking member stated, we shouldn't be holding this hearing. But redistributing wealth is about equal results, not equal opportunity. I'm a proud Democrat, and that's not what I'm here to talk about. So to directly address the two Republican concerns on the table, if you want to, one, grow the pie more, and two, you don't want to redistribute wealth, then it seems to me the only remaining option is to ensure that opportunity in America truly is equal. So let's discuss whether opportunity in America is equal or not, and whether making economic opportunity more equal, in other words, living up to those ideals in our founding documents, would help address rising economic inequality. Dr. Boucher, to begin with you, research by Professor Raj Chetty of Harvard finds that there is a very strong relationship between parental income and the future income of their children. In other words, economic inequality is not equal, but strongly inherited, and it's a generational problem. Why does growing economic inequality leave the lowest income families more at risk of generational poverty?
Well, 2 points. First, one of the things that we learned from Chetty's research that he concluded is that if you look over the period, over the past few decades, children who were born in the middle part of the 20th century, about 90% of them grew up to earn more than their parents. Kids born in 1980s, 90% are not growing up to earn more than their parents. And that decrease in absolute mobility over that time frame is not due, we could not have altered that outcome even if the economy had grown more. In fact, 70% of that decline in upward mobility was due to the rise of inequality. As he put it, it's because the rungs on the ladder have become further apart. So it's important that we connect the dots between how inequality is actually making it impossible for there to be economic opportunity. A second point from Raj Chetty's work, he has this really interesting study on patents he did with a bunch of colleagues. They found, they had data connecting what someone makes as an adult and whether or not they have a patent with their third grade math test scores and their parents' income in third grade. They found that children who scored high on their third grade test scores, more likely to grow up and get a patent. But if you were from a high income family, 4 times as likely to grow up and get a patent among that high-scoring group. That is a direct loss to our economy of productivity gains because of the stymieing of opportunity and economic mobility.
And it seems to me that if this is related to third grade test scores, then rich kids are going to better schools than poor kids. That doesn't to me mean economic opportunity is equal in America.
In this case, these were all kids in one school system. So all the kids, and you have the high scorers over here. Among those group that scored high in third grade, the ones who had rich parents, much more likely to move up and out. So
even if the school systems were equal, which we all know that they aren't.
So even among children
still a
in
problem.
the same school system, that inequality is creating a pipeline across someone's life, and it is that we need to be thinking about and connecting the dots on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've said this numerous times, but the days change. Today marks 150 days since this budget committee has failed to pass a budget. 150 days. Speaker Pelosi said that a budget is a statement of your values. It's a statement of your party's values. What's your values? Instead, we're having hearings on other items than passing a budget from this committee. It's completely ridiculous. Let's talk about this. Last month, I traveled and visited every one of our 30 counties in the month of August, visiting with families and farmers and small business owners. And in our 30 counties, 20 of those 30 counties are below the poverty level, are above the poverty level. 20 of the 30 counties are above the poverty level in southeast Missouri along the Mississippi River. What I heard from these families is that they wanted to have the opportunities. And the opportunities is what allows them to have a better quality of life. Speaking to some people that are third and fourth generations on government assistance and welfare. Think about that. Third and fourth generations. Things are a little bit better. The economy is definitely doing well. You all admitted to that in your opening testimony. But a number that I think we need to point out is 1.4 million fewer people are living in poverty today than what they used to. That's a step in the right direction. But just in the last couple years, serving on a committee here in Congress, I had a young lady that testified before the committee that I was serving on, and she gave an issue of that she had to turn away an increase in her hourly wage because of some federal welfare programs. Think about that. There's over 80 different federal welfare programs that add up to $1 trillion a year that we spend to get people out of poverty. And we started that war on poverty back in the 60s. We haven't been winning that war. But this lady testified before our committee and said, I had to turn down the increases in my hourly wage because I would lose subsidies in my child care subsidies. And my quality of living would be less if I took a $2 an hour increase in pay. That's called the poverty trap. If we want to get serious about ending inequality, we need to make sure that we don't keep and push people down to stay reliant on federal government programs. We need to give them an incentive to work themselves off the system. And I think Republicans and Democrats can agree with that. But instead, this lady had to turn down a wage increase because of that security blanket being ripped out from underneath her for child care subsidies. That's an easy fix that I think Republicans and Democrats should agree that would make the quality of life of a lot of low-income people so much better, and it's not even being discussed right now. And I think that's a point of discussion that we have to hit on. When you're talking about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, it was my provision that helped double the child tax credit, and sir, it is refundable. It increases the refundability up to $1,400. That's more than what it was before the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Do you know the district that I represent, the median income household of a family in my district is $40,000 a year for a family of four? It's one of the poorest congressional districts in the country. But you know what? Under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, those people in southeast Missouri and the Boot Hill of Missouri, my friends and neighbors, the place I've called home for 7 generations, by the changes to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of doubling the standard deduction from $12,000 to $24,000 for a husband and wife, and doubling the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000, guess what? They don't have to pay 1 cent in federal taxes if they make $55,000 or less. And that's under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That is a real impact to the door greeter at Walmart in Salem, Missouri. That's a huge impact to the cashier at Schnucks in Farmington, Missouri. And so for you all to say that you don't want that to be supportive, go talk to the people on the front lines that's barely able to buy their prescription drugs, that's working at Schnucks and Walmart and the AT&T stand at the mall on Cape Girardeau. So if we want to get serious about inequality, I gave you one way that we can start, Mr. Chairman. Let's try to all work together.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Spriggs, you had talked in your testimony about a time when economic growth and wages grew in tandem. And based on the economic data, that was a period between 1950 and 1980. We had 97% economic growth during that period, and real wages increased by 95%. That was a period of shared prosperity. Economists would call that a virtuous cycle of growth. So you had high wages, high demand equaled high economic growth. During that period of 30 years, you had annual average growth in the American economy of 4.1%. That wasn't coincidental. That was a period of time where American corporate leaders believed that it was their responsibility to balance the interest of all the stakeholders in the American economy. So it was the shareholders certainly that benefited, but it was also the managers, the workers, and the communities within which these large corporations operated. And if you look at the testimony of the CEO of GM, of DuPont, of General Electric, of Standard Oil, of Coca-Cola, their themes were all consistent. They thought it was their responsibility to help balance the economic interests of all the stakeholders. In 1962, an economist from the University of Chicago by the name of Milton Friedman wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom, which was taught in a lot of American business schools, Harvard, Stanford, and many others. And he basically argued that forget about all those stakeholders. What you should do as a corporate leader is push all the profits to the shareholders. Forget about the workers, forget about the communities, forget about your responsibility that you yourselves once accepted was yours. What happened during that period, 1980 to 2019? You had economic growth of 94% and real wages increased by 9%. 9%. It was a 39-year period. The average annual growth in the American economy was 2.8% versus 4.1% when wages were higher. In the past 20 years, 84% of the growth in the American economy went to the top 1%. That means, unless anybody on this panel is part of the top 1%, 16% of the growth in that 20-year period went to the rest of us, 99%. We just gave away a massive tax cut to American corporations. We were told by the White House Council of Economic Advisors that each household would receive $4,000 to $9,000 annually as a result of that tax cut. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen, and it never was going to happen. In fact, we have a president that is in a trade war who has imposed a tariff tax that, according to a conservative economist, Mark Zandi, from Moody's Analytics, will cost each American household $1,000. $1,000. The Trump administration and the corporate tax cut has added $3 trillion to the national debt. We will have this year, next year, the year after, a budget deficit of more than $1 trillion. So every dollar, will be $1 trillion short for every budget year. It seems to me that the way to deal with income inequality is through tax policy. Mark Zandi, also, again, a conservative, he said for every dollar that you give away in the corporate tax cut, you can expect to recapture 32 cents. The loss in investment from the corporate tax cut is 68%. 68%. So those who argue here on the margins that middle-class taxpayers have benefited from this, you have to do that within the context of the history. And clearly, the current policies are detrimental to the nation's economic growth and to the American middle class that depends greatly and have contributed historically to the economic growth. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time. Sorry I went over.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Republican Leader Womack, for holding this important hearing today to discuss solutions to economic inequality. It's appropriate for us to explore this subject as it gives us a chance to highlight the strong economic gains that have resulted from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and free market approaches from this administration and from the last Congress. In 2018 alone, median earnings for workers increased by 3.4%, and I'm going to overlay this on one of Dr. Boucher's charts in a few minutes. The number of people living in poverty fell by 1.4 million, and the number of full-time workers increased by 2.3 million. This tells us that Americans are getting off the sidelines and finding full-time work and earning good paychecks. In fact, the Federal Reserve in Atlanta recently reported that over the last year, low-wage workers in the bottom 25th percentile have experienced the fastest rate of growth and pay increases of 4.4%, higher than the 3.4% average of all workers. It appears that the other side of the aisle is simply ignoring these facts and supporting budget-busting approaches to income inequality. CBO estimates that the Democrats' 107% increase in minimum wage proposal can cost up to 3.7 million jobs. Presidential candidate Andrew Yang's universal income would cost the federal government $2.8 trillion, and single-payer health care would reportedly cost $32 trillion, in conjunction with a $93 trillion price tag for the Green New Deal. Short of modern monetary theory, which this committee won't hold any kind of a hearing on, my Democratic colleagues have no answer as to how they will find ways to pay for this wish list. Instead of having the government foot the bill for goods and services, we should focus on proven pro-growth and free market policies to create more jobs in our country, just as the last 2 years have shown us. I look forward to discussing solutions that will further improve the economic well-being of all Americans without busting the budget. Mr. Ponnuru, a lot of proposals from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to close income inequality come with heavy price tags to both economic growth and to the American taxpayer. Specifically, the proposed 107% increase in the minimum wage proposal would cost up to 3.7 million jobs. I think which is the high end of the scale, I think your number was 1.3 million. Presidential candidate Andrew Yang's proposal for universal income would cost the federal government $2.8 trillion, and single-payer health care would cost $32 trillion. It's interesting to note that my colleagues have few proposals to pay for such ideas other than modern monetary theory as we talk. Furthermore, these cumbersome government-centric approaches will slow down economic activity and put people out of jobs, which means less people will be paying taxes, while more people will become reliant on government safety nets. In contrast, since our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was signed into law, we're seeing higher tax receipts this year than last year, higher tax rate last year than the prior year. If we were blowing up the budget deficit because of the tax cuts, you'd see lower revenues to the federal government when, in fact, we're going to have a record this year. So, Mr. Ponnuru, what sort of tax structure would be required to pay for all the Democratic programs that I mentioned, the universal basic income, the higher minimum wage, the single-payer health care, or the government takeover of health care, and the Green New Deal? And what would the impact be on economic growth?
Thank you. The details of those policies would matter. People mean different things when they talk about single payer. They mean different things when they talk about a Green New Deal, but any plausible price tag, if these policies were going to be pursued with any degree of fiscal prudence, would have to involve very large and broad-based tax increases, including tax increases on the middle class of a kind that we have not seen in many decades, possibly not ever. Those tax increases could be expected to reduce the amount of work, savings, and investment, and thus to have a negative impact on job growth, on output, on national wealth. All of those things would have to be weighed, I think, very heavily in the balance.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to close with a couple of things. Again, tax receipts this year are estimated to be around $3.4 trillion, which is a lot higher than last year's $3.3 trillion, which is higher than the prior year's $3.3 trillion by a few billion dollars. Now, one of the things I was looking at Dr. Boucher's charts here, and I found these to be interesting, is that if you look at the average annual income growth for the first period of 1963 to 1979, and also 1980 to 2016, it was 1.7% for the first period, 1.3% for the second period. But what is it today for income growth? On the average is 3.4%. So higher than either one of those periods. That's how you solve economic growth. That's how you make economic growth higher and you address all wages. Now, the lowest economic growth is over here on the left-hand side. And under this chart, the assertions were that it was higher for the lowest part of the workforce and lower for the higher part of the workforce. And then the inverse happened during the second period. But today, what's interesting is it's 4.4%, which is the highest of all the income groups over the last 2 years. So I think this proves that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, with modern regulatory policy, creates better economic growth for all boats. And this, I'll close with President Kennedy's statement that he made back in the 60s. Rising economic activity lifts all boats. And what did he do to get there? He cut taxes. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I would like to let him know that we do intend to have a hearing on essentially modern monetary theory. It's going to be called Does Debt Matter?, which is essentially what we're talking about. So you'll get your chance to discuss that, absolutely. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding, I think, what's a really important conversation, and I appreciate the comments by all my colleagues, and I particularly appreciate the comments by the witnesses. I did, I find this topic fascinating. Unfortunately, I didn't really do well in economics when I was in college. I think I wasn't in the classroom nearly enough as I should have been. I wish I had known better. But so I'm trying to get caught up. I was interested, Dr. Boucher, in some of the charts that you presented. For instance, the one that shows you have by sort of quartile or quintile, I think, is the distribution. I'm looking for the chart because there's several here. But I was just curious, what's the optimal distribution? You have sort of what the distribution is and what it's been over the last 40 or 50 years in terms of distribution of wealth, distribution of income. Is there an optimal chart that we should look for, or a target that we should be, whether we decide to do something, do nothing? But what would that look like in your mind?
That's a great question. Thank you. So you want to connect the income growth to what's happening in the wider economy.
Yeah.
So I think optimally, there's two ways to measure it. One is you would like to see that wages are growing in line with productivity, because that would mean that the benefits of what workers are contributing, and most of us are workers in the economy, is being connected to what people are taking home.
And may I stop you there, because that's interesting as well. Talk to me, because that is one of your charts as well in here. It shows the divergence in, as it relates to productivity. I'm going to find the page here. I think it's the third chart that I looked at. Worker pay has lagged behind productivity. Before you go on, could you just describe, first of all, the definition of productivity, because I think this is important. It seems to mean different things to different people, but I know there's an economic definition. Obviously, I know what hourly compensation is for workers. Could you just talk about productivity, because I have a follow-up question to that.
I mean, in its most basic definition, it's how much, in terms of goods and services, are being produced per worker hour. So it's how productive we are, right? How many clients people are serving, or what quality of work is happening.
So can I stop you before, and I'm going to let you finish what you started earlier, but I noticed that the big divergence happens around 1978, 1980. And I know that former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan talked about this. What's happening? Why is this different? It's not that chart, but I think it's probably the next one. Yeah, there you go. Thank you for putting that up. So it just seems to coincide to some degree with the development and the growth, and this may be completely wrong, but just in terms of the growth of technology, particularly around productivity tools, technology of the microchip and is that something that economists look at? Is that it just happened to be coincidental? Is that not what has somewhat contributed? Because this is output for number of hours worked, whereas if you have a factory now that has double the output, fewer workers and robotics are doing more of it, that would contribute to it. Is that right, or is that not right?
Well, certainly, but that was also happening in decades before,
But
right?
has there been an acceleration in,
It's, so.
and I'm not trying to be argumentative,
No,
believe it or not.
it's a good question. You're saying that because.
No, I'm asking.
Yeah, well, so your question is, if our economy is more productive, if because of computer chips, you can produce things in twice as much, twice as many things in half as much time, the question is whether or not the workers that are still participating in that process get any of those gains, or do those gains only go to people at the very top of the income distribution? And so what we saw prior to 1980 is that even when technology made workers more productive, they shared in those gains, where now workers do not share in those gains. Those gains go almost exclusively to people at the top. And that is encapsulated the fundamental question of our times. And so the other chart that I had in my testimony showed that in the period in the 1960s and 70s, when the economy grew, families all across the income distribution saw their incomes grow at about the same rate.
That's the, if I might interrupt, and I apologize, I'm running out of time here. That's the income gains widely shared in early post-war decades, but not since then chart that shows the divergence, again, around 1980. I mean, it's...
And I think it comes down to how we reconceptualize the importance of the institutions that constrain the rise in inequality. Everything from unions to antitrust to how we thought about taxes. There was a change in mindset about whether or not it was policymakers' roles to create institutions and to support institutions that make sure that everybody has a level playing field, rather than allowing a few to increasingly reap the disproportionate gains of growth. So it wasn't one thing, it was all of these things happening together, a shift in how we thought.
Thank you. I apologize for exceeding my time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Quite all right. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to be at this hearing. And it's great because it exposes two very different ways of thinking about our economy, opportunity, and the mutually shared goal of overcoming poverty. So on the one hand, you have a deep and persistent focus on inequality. It's defined as the gap between the rich and the poor. And at first glance, that seems pretty reasonable. But in reality, it means you're dividing your attention. Half your attention is focused on protesting the wealthy, and these days that seems actually where most of the attention is. And that leaves only a small amount of focus on the real issue, which is people in poverty and their ability to move up the economic ladder. And this is the kind of backwards thinking that leads to ideas like Andrew Yang's, where we raise taxes on the rich only to give it right back to them in the form of universal basic income. It's hard to imagine a more inefficient and ineffective way to reduce poverty. So as a conservative, our approach is different. Instead of creating resentment against success, we focus on who actually needs our help, which is the people who are having trouble moving up the economic ladder. After all, the fact that there's a much wealthier person down the street from you is not the problem. The problem occurs that if you can't find opportunities even when you make all the right decisions. So the first step to understanding any problem is to get to the truth. Mr. Ponnuru, I want to go to you on this. We've heard inequality is worse than ever. Is that true, especially if we use a more accurate measure of inflation and account for welfare programs and cash transfers?
No, it does not appear to be true. The Congressional Budget Office's reports on the distribution of income suggest that income inequality peaked in 2007, that it has been falling since then. And so we are, I think, to some extent looking at a problem in the rearview mirror. Of course, that could change. Maybe next year's numbers will be different, but the trends over the last decade or so have been towards shrinking inequality.
And then let's talk about the people we really want to help, those in the bottom quintile of earners. So let's find out who they are. So can you break that apart demographically? I mean, who are the people in the bottom quintile? Maybe that helps us focus our problem setting here.
So people in the bottom quintile, and differ from people in the other quintiles across a variety of measures. One of the more important things to look at is the number of workers in the household. The top quintile is going to be much more likely to have 2 earners in that household, and the bottom quintile is much more likely to have 0 earners in the household. Obviously, that's going to make a huge difference in how much income you've got. There's also the question of age. If you're retired or if you're young and in school, you may very well be in the lowest quintile. Doesn't mean you are always going to be in that quintile or always were. Lifetime inequality is lower.
Right, so it's possible that we're placing a teenager who lives with their parents in the bottom quintile of earners and saying that, okay, that's 1 extra person in the under the poverty line, right? Statistically speaking.
Right. Inequality seems to have increased however you measure it, but it is, I think, important to have that perspective.
Right. It also turns out that 56% of Americans will at some point in their lives be in the top 10% of earners. 73% of Americans will be in the top 20% of earners in their lifetime. That's an amazing statistic. Doesn't mean we can't always do better, but it's an amazing statistic. It also turns out my colleagues are right that the middle class is shrinking. It's just not in the way that they think. Turns out the data shows the middle class is shrinking because they're moving up into higher income households over time. This is all good news. Doesn't mean we can't improve. The point is that the rhetoric about inequality is not only inaccurate, but it's just flat out unhelpful to the people we're actually trying to help. So let's talk about solutions really quick. We want to empower people to rise up instead of disempowering them with more handouts. And how do we do that? And you don't need to take my word for this. Okay, Mayor Bloomberg, okay, prominent Democrat, studied this extensively with 30 different pilot programs. And what they found is there's different solutions for different kinds of poverty, and they're localized solutions. We have to be thinking about it that way. So back to you, Doctor. How else can we empower people to rise up? You talk about occupational licensing. You know, I have a constituent in my district. Her name is Ashley. She owns a hair wash and style company. She can't find stylists because Texas requires 1,000 hours of licensing to wash and dry hair. Okay, I learned how to free fall out of an airplane at 30,000 feet in less time than that. That's crazy. Can you talk about more solutions like that? You mentioned housing. What kinds of deregulation? What kind of vocational training can we be working on so that we empower people to rise above their current economic status?
So I think with this little time I have here, what we should be doing is focusing specifically on mobility, opportunity, and fighting poverty, not as much on inequality per se, and identifying barriers often created by the government that we can get out of the way.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me and for holding this very important hearing. As we've heard, the pace of economic inequality has increased dramatically over the past few decades, and many have made this point. Mr. Higgins brought data that I think points to this really stark dichotomy that we've seen increased inequality over the last several decades, and that this administration continues to push policies that further reduce support for those families that are struggling. And has been discussed here already, the Republican tax bill gave even more advantage to the wealthiest Americans and to the largest corporations in the United States and overlooked the needs of working families as we continually see greater income inequality. The Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a refundable credit for low-wage workers, and the Child Tax Credit are two very significant ways we can help families start to get ahead. And in fact, just listening to the debate here today and the conversation, I appreciate the enthusiasm that I've heard from some of my colleagues on the other side for the expansion of the Child Tax Credit. I couldn't agree with them more. I invite them to sign on to my legislation, but I find it difficult to fully accept that enthusiasm when they were given the opportunity to make permanent those provisions, which I think were not enough anyway. For example, they could have made it fully refundable, didn't do that. They could have made them permanent, didn't do that. The provisions that they did include, as modest as they were, expire in 2025. But what happened to the provisions for wealthy corporations? They were made permanent. So not only is a budget a statement of our values, but our tax policy is a statement of our values as well. If this is such a high priority, Why did you set it to end for hardworking families and only get a modest break, and then give a massive break, a permanent break, to wealthy corporations? So, one question, if I could just pose to Dr. Boucher and also Dr. Spriggs. Number one, did those provisions actually do anything, when you look at the totality of the 2017 tax bill, did those modest temporary provisions do anything to increase income equality in this country, or did the totality of that tax bill actually take us in the opposite direction?
Well, in the totality, it moved us in the opposite direction. And I certainly commend your leadership on the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, and that we do need to make that fully refundable. Proponents claim that the new tax law would boost wages, but there's been no evidence that has been directly responsible. One of the things that we did see, of course, is that corporations used that tax windfall for a record $1 trillion plus in stock buybacks in 2018. That is that is a really big number of income that is going to those at the very, very top in exchange for a long-term gap in revenue for the United States to make the investments that we need to make in people and families. So I think especially over the long term, this is really just pushing us exactly in the wrong direction on multiple levels.
Dr. Spriggs?
First, thank you for representing my wife's hometown of Flint and Genesee County. So
She's a Flintstone. You chose well.
I moved up. So there is an inequality tax that low-income people pay because they don't provide enough of the market to drive where prices go. When you exacerbate the big share of the market, you add more demand at the wrong end. So the price of childcare goes up as inequality goes up, because that's where the market is. And so, yes, you gave a tax credit, but then it gets taken away with increased cost of child care. So when you look at earnings gains that have been made, those who are middle income and the next one lower are finding the burdens increasing during this entire expansion, because housing costs, child care costs, education costs have all gone up faster than their earnings, because the earnings at the top are going up faster and the prices are following those earners. And the earned income tax credit excludes single people.
Right.
They are currently being taxed into poverty. And the Working Families Tax Bill, which corrects the earned income tax credit excluding these workers and fixes the issue that the child tax credit should be fully refundable, are important steps to restore the balance that's in that bill. And as you pointed out, if corporations need a permanent cut, working people need a permanent cut.
Thank you very much. I've exceeded my time. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to have to leave in just a minute to attend a conference committee on the Defense Authorization Act and make a statement. Mr. Horsford is going to chair. But before I leave, I just wanted to thank all the witnesses again, as well as the members, for your testimony. And I wish I could stay around, but I was going to be able to come back, but it looks like we're not going to have enough members to make that possible. So with that said, I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you. Technology, yeah. Just a couple of facts, and I have a question that deals with the child tax credit. But Columbia University School of Social Work Center on Poverty and Social Policy estimated in a 2013 report that poverty has fallen nearly 40% since the 1960s. Much of that reduction is due to our social safety net programs. And I'm not being self-serving, but about 3 years ago, I wrote a book which was called the least among us waging the battle for the vulnerable. And what I found there was that the social safety net programs were crafted by Democrats and Republicans. In fact, realizing the economic challenges that we're facing, families in this country moved to assist that process. What are some of the social safety net programs? We've got Social Security, lifts 26.5 million people out of poverty. EITC, child tax credit, 9.1 million people. SNAP, 4.5 million people. SSI, 3.3 million people. Housing assistance, 2.5 million people. Now let's take a look at what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are interested in doing. First of all, they want to change the way that the federal government measures poverty, thereby throwing people off of these programs, not acknowledging that they live in poverty. They want to reduce the number of people who are eligible for nutrition assistance, continually cutting back on a food stamp program. They want to eliminate the low-income housing energy assistance program, the LIHEAP program, $4 billion cut in the $4 billion cut in the president's 2020 budget. They want to eliminate affordable housing programs, the very programs that have helped to lift people out of poverty. So when my colleagues talk about poverty, take a look at what the record is and what havoc you are wrecking in people's lives and continuing to push people into poverty in this nation. Don't talk out of both sides of your mouth, because what you would do with some of these programs to make them so onerous as to humiliate people into not taking advantage of the programs that are there. The child tax credit. 83% of the Republican tax law went to the richest 1% of the people in this country. Your child tax credit is supposed to go to everyone. You left a third of the kids and families who earn too little to get a full credit. Those left behind included disproportionately families with young kids, rural families. Members of the Congress made themselves eligible for the child tax credit for the very first time. So we now can get a $2,000 child tax credit for each child. But you know, many military families, families who are earning the minimum wage, only got a $75 increase. We have a piece of legislation called the American Family Act, which I'm proud to have authored. We would give the same full child tax credit to families earning minimum wage, military families, rural families, families with young kids, all of those left behind by the GOP tax bill. Endorsed by scholars across the country, consistent with the National Academy of Sciences, showing what would be the most effective policy to reduce child poverty in this country. Now, there are two questions. Dr. Boucher, we know what the tax cut did. I don't care what they say. We know who got the benefit of it. It has been proven over and over and over again. $75 increase to families to reduce inequality. Talk for a moment about providing a child tax credit to the families that I am talking about. And I also want to ask you, Dr. Spriggs, you know, this conversation about technology and moving forward, and in fact, that is what the cost of technology is. That's where poverty sees its face. We do know that a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Joe Stiglitz, no schlep in the economy world, here says that inequality is not inevitable. It is about the choices we make. Dr. Spriggs, how much of inequality is due to the public policies decisions that we make?
The gentlelady's time has expired, but I will allow you to respond.
Thank you, Chair Horsford. Quickly, the divide in 1980 is because we changed policies. because we redistributed income from workers to those at the top. When you look at that gap in productivity and what workers make, when we see the declining labor share, we redistributed by taking away from workers the ability to negotiate. We uninvented a middle-income nation. We redistributed today, if you wanted to correct it, some close to $650 billion worth of income out of the middle towards the top by denying workers a decent minimum wage that kept up with productivity, and to working people the right to negotiate about the increases in their productivity and who gets it.
Dr. Boucher?
And I would just, I agree.
Child tax credit?
Child tax credit, it is important that it is fully refundable for all the groups that you mentioned. I think you made that case very eloquently, and that should be incorporated into our tax law, so I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I will now recognize Mr. Khanna from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Dr. Boucher, thank you for many of your insights. Dr. Spriggs, I've appreciated yours. Ms. Evans, appreciate your being here. Mr. Ponnuru, I read your work all the time, even though I disagree. Thank you for being here. My question is simple. There are 70 million American families that make under $75,000 a year. They have, by and large, not had a meaningful raise in the last 40 years. And we can quibble about whether wages are slightly going up or not, but by and large, 70 million Americans making under $75,000 haven't had a raise over the last 40 years. In 2019, the projected corporate profits in this country are going to be $9 trillion. $9 trillion. So if we wanted to have a program in the Congress, and I'd like all the witnesses to answer this, that would give a 20% raise in the next 2 years to these 70 million American families, what would be the actions or policies that would achieve that? Dr. Boucher, we can start with you.
So give them a 20% raise in the next 2 years? Is that what you're
Next 2 years.
Wow, that is a tall order, and I appreciate the ambition. I think so. There's a lot of things you can do. I mean, one is that you can raise the minimum wage. That's going to focus on those at the very bottom, so not at the very top of that 75,000, but at the bottom part. You can make sure that they have the right to organize and bargain collectively, because that does have the capacity to boost wages. You can make sure that their costs are kept low. Not necessarily going to raise our wages, but you can focus on raising the wages of the workers that provide care. So through fully funding programs for home health aides, for nursing assistants, for childcare workers, that could go a long way towards boosting a lot of those lower, the folks under 75,000. And you could make sure that you rethink the way that we enforce our rules around market structure. We know now that one of the things that's really keeping wages down is what economists call monopsony, which is that many workers work in labor markets where they have a single employer. They don't have a lot of bargaining power. We need to incorporate that value into how we enforce antitrust. So that's a long list.
Let me just keep it to 45 seconds so we get all of these. And I do want to recognize Dr. Boucher and Rosa DeLauro, our leader here on these issues with paid family leave, paid sick days, equal pay, and is handing me a note, affordable child care. So I want to make sure I'm making Representative DeLauro's points. She has been a huge leader on this in the Congress for decades. Dr. Spriggs.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of celebration about wages rising at the bottom. That is from minimum wage increases, because the majority of American workers today don't have $7.25 as a minimum wage because Congress has refused to raise their wages. States and cities have responded, and so the rise at the bottom is because we have raised the minimum wage successfully in some states. So that's key. It's also key to reach greater equality and gender equality between men and women. Equal Pay Act would go a long way towards that. Because women are a rising and important part of the labor force, the inequality that they face is an important and rising part of the equation for what causes general inequality. We have to give workers back their right to organize. This is a human right. It is globally recognized as a human right. The United States stands out as the one country where, for most multinationals, this is their non-union plant. It is embarrassing for the United States. So we have to give Americans back that right. We have to restore in the public sector what the pay of teachers used to be. Their relative pay, their pay relative to all other workers has been falling. What they do has not fallen in importance. And we have to give some focus to correcting what has been going on in the public sector for public sector workers, broadly speaking. That'll raise the pay of a lot of people pretty quickly.
Mr. Ponnuru, I just want to give you 30 seconds if you have a similar or alternative perspective, just to be fair. I think we only have 30 seconds left.
Sure. I would just say that if you define the objective as a 20% increase for scores of millions of people within 2 years, you pretty much have to do just straight up redistribution, that it has to be something like a universal basic income that is set at a high level. I happen to think that that is a bad idea, but nothing else I've heard, including anything I've heard right now, would come close to meeting that target.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is expired. I will now recognize Mr. Series from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I apologize for not being here earlier. 3 hearings at 10 o'clock, it gets a little difficult. And if it's redundant, the question I ask, I apologize. Somebody else. You know, there's a lot of talk about the tax bill that was passed in 2017. And I'd just like to know, how do you think that has impacted the inequality that exists today, this new tax bill? Either one.
Well, because it went overwhelmingly and disproportionately to those at the top, it has exacerbated inequality. And I think my comments earlier were misinterpreted. It's not that individuals saw their taxes go up, but the shift and burden from where taxes come has been shifted down because we made the tax system less progressive. So a greater burden of taxes have to come from labor income, which is the declining part of national income. And a smaller burden is being placed on the rising parts of income. Those are the top 1%, corporations, and this makes the system more unfair because going forward, in order to get the revenue necessary to have an economy that can work, is going to have to come from those at the bottom. And as we discussed earlier, the portion of the tax cut that goes to workers expires. And that deficit obviously then has to come from making up that deficit, has to come from that source. So this is the big problem that the Budget Committee faces because the nature of where the income is coming from doesn't match where income is rising and falling, and it complicates the problem going forward for the Budget Committee.
Let me add a couple of things. When we think of inequality, we're often focused on the individual families, but the other thing that the tax cut was, what we were promised, of course, it would lead to this massive increase in investment. That's the economic argument from the other side, that if you lower those taxes for corporations on the wealthy, that it'll lead to that boon. Of course, we haven't seen that, and that is the only way that the tax cut at the top would translate into higher wages for individuals is if you saw that investment and those gains of that greater productivity were shared with workers. So I think that, thinking about that kernel of the argument is really important as well, that we've not seen that investment boon. And in fact, as I noted earlier, corporations use that tax windfall to give out a record $1 trillion in stock buybacks in 2018. So instead of using that to invest in productive capacity, make our economy more innovative, more productive, they used it as a boondoggle for those at the top of the income ladder. So that's exacerbating inequality, not just today, but for decades to come.
And can you talk a little bit about or elaborate on the relationship between the decreasing union membership and increasing inequalities?
Yes, so much is tied to a chart that would show you increases in union density and decline in union density and all the patterns we've been talking about, America became more equal as more workers had the ability to collectively bargain with their boss. I'm more productive. How do I share in that? And when workers had that voice, their wages tended to go up with productivity. As they have lost that voice, not just union members, but non-union members also suffer wage losses. Because when we had high union density, many employers took the lead from what was happening in the unionized sector for setting their own wages. So that loss of voice in the workplace has meant a very high correlation that other people have looked at and found can explain about 40% of the disproportionate rise of income in the top 10%. Essentially, the finance and management classes of America who get to say where the productivity goes, as opposed to the workers who are making the product. And that gap is important for understanding the weight of inequality on our economy, because when you shift from the market being the middle to the market being the top, there are all sorts of implications that make it difficult to produce residential investment, which has not been very strong this recovery because the bulk of Americans can't afford housing, because we're not going to get the college-educated workforce we need. We are falling behind. We've gone from 1st to 19th in terms of our rank among advanced countries in terms of who has a highly college-educated workforce. This is all in the wrong direction, because in order to get that kind of investment in housing and in education, you need a different shaped market. You need a market that is aimed at the middle. And you can't do that when all the income and all the market is at the top.
Thank you. My time is up.
Thank you. I will now recognize Ms. Lee from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank yourself and our ranking member for holding this very important hearing. I do chair the Majority Leader's Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity. I care deeply about rising income inequality in our country and have been working on it for many years. So I just want to thank all of you so much for being here and laying this out before the Budget Committee. Your testimony is extremely important as we move forward. As many of you have pointed out, since the 70s, economic growth for middle class and low income workers, it's only risen actually by one third, while income for the top 1% has tripled. This is especially true for CEOs whose salary has grown by 1,000% since 1978. And I know, Dr. Spriggs, you know this very well. According to a recently released report by the AFL-CIO on executive pay, the average pay gap among CEO to worker ratio was 278 to 1. That's unbelievable. In the richest nation on earth, that productivity and work hours have continued to skyrocket while workers' wages have shamefully fallen behind. This is especially true for Black and brown families. The income gap between Black and whites today remains almost at exactly the same level from the 1960s. For example, according to a report from the Institute for Policy Studies, the median Black family today owns $3,600, just 2% of the wealth of the median value of a white family. The median Latino family owns $6,600, just 4% of the median white family. So just let me ask you this question, because we always talk about income inequality, but why don't we frame this as racial or income and racial inequality? Because we know that we have to have targeted resources and some strategies to address the legacy of racism on wealth building. And I'm not sure, and I apologize for not being here through the entire hearing, but I'm not sure if the issue of race has come up, and I hope that somehow we really look at that layer, because we can't talk about income inequality without talking about racial inequality.
Just to weigh in on that, I'm so glad you brought that up. Just to add to your statistics, we know that even being higher educated doesn't protect Black families in terms of wealth building, because even if they increase their educational attainment, their wealth is still lower than it should be relative to whites who have higher education. And so it's important to think about the racial component of wealth. That's one reason why I actually think that a wealth tax is very important, because it would hit families who are white families much more than families of color. It would be a way of addressing that inequality in a direct way. When we talk about taxing at the top, for the most part, we're talking about taxing, we're not going to be talking about taxing families of color because they're not there. So it's a way to integrate that progressivity. And then at the same time, to be making sure that we have the resources that we need to create the widespread opportunity that we need to do to address poverty. So implicit in that agenda that I laid out in my testimony is policies that would, I think, go a long way towards addressing the race and the racial wealth gap through policies that tax at the top and focus on redistribution.
Some of us are supporting HR 40. The moment I think has come to study and look at what reparations mean. What do you think about just looking at this dynamic around reparations as it relates to the racial wealth gap that has historically been systemic in this country for 400 years?
It's vitally important because at the root is being blind when we make policies across the board on many issues, and the effect of many policies that on face appear race neutral, they are not. So giving a tax cut like we just did has a racially disparate impact because of the huge tax cut we gave from which people of color did not benefit when you look at who got that huge part of the tax cut. So policies like that matter. And it's the accumulation of being blind to those policies. Studying that will allow people to go back and revisit it. This is why we cannot have a regional minimum wage. A regional minimum wage would have such a huge racial disparate impact, it would border on being just outright racist because it singles out Black women and women of color to not be protected by a rising wage standard that we would give to all other Americans. It's surgical in the way that it does it. So it's analyzing policies in that way. The decline in union density has been most dramatic among Black workers, and the lack of access to union membership has been most detrimental to Black workers who disproportionately live in right-to-work states. The PRO Act is very important for making sure that workers everywhere have access to the right to organize, and it's especially important because the pay increase that Black workers get from union membership and the pay increase that Latino workers get from union membership is far greater. And this helps to close the racial income gap. And the challenge for the nation is, as the current population of kids who are K through 12 are now the plurality, are the children of color, the fact that Latino and Black households have no wealth, relying on the market to provide a highly educated workforce is not going to work.
Thank you.
60% of Black children today come from a household where the maximum expected family contribution is 0. So it has clear budget implications if we want, as a nation, to have a highly educated workforce.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to suggest to this committee that the next time we have a hearing on economic inequality, we add racial. We have to say economic and racial inequality. Otherwise, we're missing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time is expired. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Womack, for 10 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I hope that I don't have to take as much time. A lot of the questions that I had for the panel have already been asked by many of my colleagues. There are a couple of things, a couple of unfinished pieces of business, and I want to direct this next couple of questions to Mr. Ponnuru. We've heard in the discussion, and I thought I saw a chart up there on the gap between wages and productivity that came up earlier in the conversation, that wages and productivity have come apart. Is that true?
I think that the best evidence suggests that no, it is not true, and that claims to the contrary that are quite widespread, that these things have come apart, that productivity has gone up and wages have not gone up commensurately, rely on not comparing apples to apples, using different groups of workers to look at wages and different groups of workers to look at productivity, using different inflation measurements to adjust for changes over time in each of those trends. If you correct for those phenomena,
And
there's
different
nothing.
eras, too.
Right, there is no substantial gap. These things have moved basically in tandem, and that has been shown not just by economists who are more associated with conservatism, but economists who are more associated with liberalism, the Democratic Party, such as Lawrence Summers.
Yeah, I think it's important to get an apples-to-apples comparison, and it's very difficult to do, particularly when you're comparing life today with maybe 50 years ago. And I saw a chart that showed that gap widening from about 1980 out. There was a suggestion made that because we go to robotics, that we're finding that the speed of technology has created in the innovative minds of corporate America the opportunity to do some things that help their bottom line. The speed at which technology is changing, and that some of this speed is affecting the American worker, has accelerated over time, has it not?
Well, it depends on the time period you're looking at, but a lot of particularly the concerns people express about rapid automation and technological change, you would think would be reflected in accelerating productivity, and that has not really been happening. The most important thing you could do, though, to increase wages over time would be to increase productivity, and we lose sight of that if we buy this misleading narrative about what's happened to wages and productivity.
In response to Mr. Crenshaw's last question, and you were in the process of answering it when time expired, you talked, the question was something along the lines, how can we help that bottom quintile of American workers without just throwing money at the problem? What are the things? So you mentioned mobility as being one of those. What are the things that we can do that can kind of help lift as we continue to see people being lifted out of poverty in that lower quintile?
Well, I do think that there are public policies at state, local, and federal level that would be useful in expanding opportunity and combating poverty. An expansion of the child tax credit, which people on both sides of the aisle today have talked about, would be one of those things. Loosening restrictions on housing, particularly in some of the highest growth parts of the country, so that people could afford to move there and maybe find better prospects than they have where they are, would be another one. Changing the way a lot of our means-tested programs work so that they have fewer poverty traps and fewer marriage penalties in them would be another. There is no shortage of places where I think we could make a substantial positive difference and possibly be able to find some bipartisan agreement.
Dr. Spriggs, I found it ironic that you mentioned in one of your responses to a question earlier the concept of a budget. Ironic in a sense that you're appearing before the Budget Committee, the Budget Committee that is supposed to produce a budget. And the fact that a budget was not produced by my friends on the other side of the aisle, don't you find that a bit ironic?
I recall living through so many Congresses before this Congress that didn't produce a budget. I'm not sure that I find it ironic in the sense that you just used the term.
How important is a budget?
Congress resolving authorization for our agencies is important because, as you have seen in the previous 3 Congresses, when we didn't have a budget and we couldn't resolve authorizations in time, that federal procurement was greatly delayed. And federal agencies need that budget authority and the authorization in place in time to do and plan their purchases in an efficient way. It reduces the efficiency of the government, and we have seen that in the last 3 Congresses because of that delay in the process, that in the 4th quarter, GDP suffers because government procurement activities have to stop, and then we see a boom in the next quarter because government workers finally have the authorization to do what they're supposed to do.
All right. Dr. Boucher, I have a question about, I want to pivot to Social Security because it's been on my mind for a long time. And I know that there's a bill, the Social Security 2100 Act, that you're probably familiar with. Congressional Democrats have proposed it. sponsored by 210 Democrat members in the House, including 19 on this committee, would increase Social Security portion of the payroll tax on all workers from 12.4% to 14.8%. Do you support increasing that payroll tax?
I am not familiar enough with that bill to comment on it, but I'm happy to get back to you in writing.
You know, Social Security, according to the trustees, is going to be insolvent in 2034, 2035. Pick one of those years, which I think in anybody's estimation is right around the corner, fits my definition of right around the corner. But let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that that bill was before the House of Representatives today, raising the payroll tax from 12.4% to 14.8%. Given how important Social Security is to a lot of people, vulnerable people in our country, would that not have an impact on some of these lower quintiles, i.e., would it have a negative impact on a lot of workers at the lower economic scale, so to speak?
You're saying that the payroll tax would have an impact rather than but you also said that the trust fund needs resources in order to continue to pay out benefits, which do help those lower income families disproportionately. So your job as a policymaker is that this is a policy that for decades has lifted people out of poverty. It's one of the most important programs that actually lifts children out of poverty, because children live with elderly or parents that are on
But the question
disability,
is
and
on the payroll tax itself. If raising the payroll tax, wouldn't it have a disproportionately larger increase on low-income workers than it would be on the high-income workers?
It's such an important question, and what
Why
we
I
know,
ask it.
yeah, I'm very glad you're asking. What we know is that these benefits are incredibly important, and so it must be our priority to make sure that those benefits are there for future generations. We know that that payroll taxes are regressive.
But would it, reclaiming my time, would it disproportionately impact the lower income
Well,
spectrum?
as I said, I don't know enough about the legislation, but in other policies that have looked to reform Social Security, that's also included raising the cap. So if they did that, that could be very progressive. So I don't know enough about the details.
So given the importance of workers to beneficiaries in the whole social safety net formula, Medicare, Social Security, the two big ones, it stands to reason that the more people you have working, the better off you will be, right? From a standpoint of funding those social safety net programs. Is that correct?
Yes.
So from that standpoint, seeing that we've increased jobs, and I believe directly attributable to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we may disagree on that, but I think it has had a big impact. Has that not helped the social safety net structure of this country, i.e. helping put important resources into those programs that benefit such a large number of people who fit in that vulnerable category and rely solely on those programs?
Certainly, increasing the labor supply is very important, but we have to remember, of course, that the United States has a lower labor force participation rate now than our economic competitors for both men and women, which is a shift from decades before, in no small part because we don't offer them the policies that allow them to adjudicate their challenges between work and family life. So I think you are exactly on the money in terms of the question, but I think it's also making sure that we're doing more to improve labor supply through things like paid family leave or addressing short-term disability.
Mr. Ponnuru, since November of 2016, 6.3 million jobs have been created. Can you talk about how this has improved the labor market and impacts the financial prospects of the average worker? In the few seconds I have left, but since Ms. DeLauro took a minute and a half and then got 20 more seconds from Mr. Khanna, I don't feel so in violation.
So just about every economic indicator that we have has been pointed in the right direction over the last several years, whether you're talking about wages in general, wages at the low end of the labor market, labor force participation rates, job growth. Everything has been moving in a positive direction over this period. In fact, not just moving in a positive direction, but moving in a positive direction in a way that people had not thought was possible. There was a question, the Federal Reserve itself believed we had reached full employment a few years ago, and it turned out that it was possible to bring unemployment down further without causing inflation to take off, which is a measure, I think, of how strong this economy has been.
Yeah, thanks to the panel.
I thank the ranking member. fortunately could get back here and take my time. I think the gentleman from New Jersey has another question. Did you have another question? I yield to you.
Yes, talking about Social Security just popped in my mind. Do you know undocumented workers, how much money they contribute to the Social Security? Do you?
The Social Security Administration has conveniently decided that they wouldn't give continuous reports on the unclaimed tax revenue. The last picture we had of that, it's measured in the billions of dollars that are a part of the trust fund because we can't allocate it because those weren't valid Social Security numbers. A tiny portion of that, of course, is just error, but a big chunk of that are the contributions of people who are undocumented here in this nation. It is going to be a true crisis when those people reach retirement, that they will not have access to the money that they have put into the Social Security Fund. Because they are a significant share of our population, and because they have been here so long, when they reach that age, which is going to be soon, we're going to have a very serious issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. So, good to be back. One of the things that I think is unfortunate is that in talking about income and wealth inequality in this country and the growing, how it's growing, we have not really projected so far this hearing, projected in the future as to what this would mean. And this is the Budget Committee. And so I'm interested in both from Dr. Boucher and Dr. Spriggs for your comments on what, if this trend continues, if the spread between the wealthiest and everybody else gets worse, or if it stays the same, what are the implications for the federal budget and therefore for all of the taxpayers going forward?
Well, so let me say two things. One is that since the mid-teens, when Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, came out, and he made the argument that today's high income inequality was calcifying into wealth inequality and that would continue to increase. There's been a lot of work by economists all across the world, but in the United States, trying to understand what that would mean for our economy and our society. There is an increased awareness, I think, of the kinds of effects that he talked about and confirmation. In terms of the budget, one of the things that we know is that as income and especially wealth inequality has increased, that has had an effect on agenda setting for democratic institutions, for things like passing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, the amount of money at the top of the income ladder that went into making sure that that went into law, which itself exacerbates inequality. So one line of questioning is, to what extent does that inequality subvert our democratic institutions or create the bandwidth for policies that then allow those groups to continue to garner wealth? I think the other thing that we have to keep thinking about is how this is very much connected to the concentration across firms. So, and once we see monopolies being created in a particular industry, that too creates these concentrations of economic resources and affects the policymaking process.
There are certain key things that inequality creates. A huge part has to do with the distortion of the markets and the marketplace. When income rises uniformly, you create many more potential new customers. So if you think about the over 185 million customer units in the United States, if everybody gets a raise, that's a potential 185 million new customers for American business. When it's only 5%, that's a different country, it's a different market. And the virtual cycle, when we had rising wages for everyone, was that it's easier to start a business if I only have to pick off somebody from 185 million versus a very small number of people. New firm formation since the 1980s in the United States has been declining specifically for that reason. And this recovery is slowing. We know we created almost 500,000 fewer jobs than we thought we had because new firm formation is slowing. In an environment in which people say we're giving tax cuts to businesses, we're getting rid of regulation, that's not what businesses want. They want you to give them customers. And what happens? Well, the only way I can grow my business is either I cut my prices, which means I cut my wages, the wrong virtual cycle. Now we're all going down. Or I buy my competitor because I buy new customers. And we have seen both. We've seen slowing business creation and more business consolidation. This creates challenges for the budget because where do you get the revenue from? And the other part of the budget is hopefully this body is concerned with what nation do we have? Are we going to have a nation with a well-educated workforce? If the price of college, because it's determined by the market is only the people at the top. We have so many universities in the United States where more students are from the top 1% than the bottom 40%. Major universities. The University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, a major, huge university, has more students from the top 1% than the bottom 40%. That's not a formula going forward. And so the Budget Committee has to be confronted with, how are you going to get the 40% educated? And so if you say, well, we're not going to pay attention to that, then you're going to wake up 20 years from now, we're not going to be the 19th best educated out of 28 advanced countries. We're going to be the least educated among advanced economies. And that's not a formula that's going to work going forward. You're not going to get the housing investment that's necessary to make our economy turn.
We're seeing kind of an example of this dilemma we're in right now with the General Motors strike. It seems to me that we have workers who made some sacrifices to save their company when GM was on the verge of going bankrupt. The taxpayers bailed GM out. GM is now doing very well, but the increase in profits to GM has not been shared to much of an extent with the workers. And one of the things that they did, and I represent 2 Ford facilities in my district, and they did a similar thing, was to say, okay, they negotiated when they were in troubled times and said, well, we're going to create 2 levels of employee. They may be doing the same job, but one's going to be continue to pay $25, $30, $40 an hour that they were, but those coming into those jobs are going to be paid $16, $17, $18. And that type of thing, well, those people show up in the employment numbers, so the employment numbers look good, the unemployment goes down, but they're not really, they're still essentially going to be a burden on the taxpayers because a lot of them aren't going to make a sustainable wage. Is that playing itself out across the economy, or is this an isolated example?
No, unfortunately, it plays itself out. This is unique because these workers are unionized and they have a voice, and we get to actually hear from them their concern. The case of General Motors is extreme because what the UAW did was totally bail out this new company. The new company, a large part of their stock was put in trust to the United Auto Workers to provide for the health care of incumbent retirees and UAW members. That was a total blessing to this new company that the union agreed to take on this risk. What those workers who are there now did was make the company profitable enough to pay back the United States government with interest. And now they're saying we gave up wages. The current workers were not given retirement health pledges. They weren't given the same retirement. And they're saying, we saved the company. We saved the company. The UAW, by taking on the risk of investing heavily in that company, putting the entire risk of their health insurance on the table to make this company profitable. And the workers are saying, okay, we did that. So what's unique here is for once in public, we get to understand the depth that American workers have sacrificed in order to help American corporations succeed. And we're finally hearing the voices of workers on improving productivity and saying, where's our share? So now it plays out for us to see.
I don't have a lot of time left. Dr.
Yeah, well,
Boucher,
you see it in different ways across the economy. An economist, David Weil, has called this a particular trend workplace fissuring. And by that, he means increasingly you see workers who are employed by a firm, but they're employed by a subcontractor rather than the major firm. And so you go into a hotel and all the people you may be coming into contact with aren't working at the big hotel chain. They're working for these smaller subcontractors. And that means that the profits, the earnings of that brand are not, they don't have to be shared with all of those subcontracted workers. We're seeing that all across the economy. And it's yet another way where we're creating these fissured workplaces, these different workplaces for some categories of workers, and that's part of what has been driving this long-term gap between productivity and wages.
Right. Well, my time has expired. Does the ranking member have any closing remarks to make? All right, well, with that, in that case, I want once again to thank all the witnesses. Thanks to the members for their participation. And with no further business, this meeting is adjourned. This hearing is adjourned. Thanks, Steve.